VER presents HD SLR Shooter, live from Cine Gear 2017. Sponsored by Blackmagic Design and Carl Zeiss.
Hi, Clint with HD SLR Shooter, continuing on our coverage of Cine Gear 2017. I'm here with Director of Photography, Jeff Berlin, and photographer as well, right?
And Sony Artisan.
And Sony Artisan.
Yes.
Artisan. Jeff, I'm excited to have an opportunity, and this is the cool thing about Cine Gear is, we're able to sit down and, talk with filmmakers that, at another trade show we might have to chase them down or something like that. There's just not the opportunity. But because we're in Los Angeles and because we're on the Paramount lot and it's a bit more casual, people get to have conversations with someone like you. Jeff, talk a little bit about your career, because you have gone, I remember in 2008 when video shooters were starting to shoot stills because DSLRs were being used for filmmaking, and then still shooters were starting to shoot video because they were starting to experience the possibilities. And that's kind of the classic scenario. Can you talk a little bit about
Actually, in 2008, I was still shooting film.
Oh, you were?
I was shooting film cameras, but my background is as a still photographer. Mm-hmm. So I hadn't, in 2008, I hadn't actually yet made the transition from film to digital as a still photographer. I didn't do that till 2009.
Wow.
With the Canon 5D Mark II.
Right.
And then one of the specific reasons I picked the 5D Mark II back in 2009 was because of the potential to also shoot video in addition to stills in one
So
device.
Did you just start trying to play with the video a little bit and say, see what I can do with it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was pretty off my radar through about 2011, the idea of being a videographer or a DP. I was still very still photo centric. My background is as a fashion photographer, shooting fashion, beauty, and then celebrity portraits. I lived in Milan and Paris for 5 years. I mean, I did from New York, so I did that whole fashion thing. Mm-hmm. And then in Los Angeles, because of the business, what it is out here, I started getting into celebrity portraits. But it wasn't until about 2011 when a friend of mine was working on a film that I was really exposed to a film set and shooting behind the scenes. I was shooting behind the scenes stills in a big blimp, and everything. But I was paying attention to the camera department and how they did things. And I learned how to load one of those Panaflex cameras and just, being around it and kind of absorbing. And then a friend of mine who's a producer called me up one day and he said, "Hey, can you do what you do as a still photographer? Your look, but make it move. Can we do that in video?" And then he was like, "Have you ever heard of this fashion designer, Norma Kamali?" And I was like, "Yes, let's try this." And so that was essentially my first entree, or my first foray into video, was doing a fashion brand video for Norma Kamali. And we shot that in New York.
Wow. Now, since that time, you've been cinematographer on what, 2, 3 features?
I did a small feature that's in post called The Locksmith. Mm-hmm. Another one called Anathema that is also in post. I was one of the producers of and shot second camera on the first theatrical feature film to be shot on Sony Alpha. And we shot that on the Sony A7 II with Leica Summicron lenses.
And what was the name of that movie?
That movie is called 3 Days in August.
Mm-hmm.
It hit theaters in December, and it's now on Amazon and iTunes and DirecTV.
So you shot an entire feature utilizing the Alphas?
The whole feature on Sony Alpha exclusively. We didn't use any other camera. We went, so I have here a new A9. This isn't the camera that we shot with. We shot on the A7 II.
This just came out a couple of days ago.
This just came out, within the past few weeks. But on the Alpha cameras, just like most of the cameras, they have an HDMI out. And so you get a really good, 422 signal out of the HDMI. We went into Shoguns. And
the Anathema Shoguns.
Into the Shoguns. And that Shogun, the ProRes HQ, very high megabit, very high quality, So and then we used that file for the film.
For the film itself. Talk a little bit about were you becoming an artisan with Sony? Did that happen prior to you shooting video, or did that happen as a still shooter, or did that happen afterwards?
It came as a still shooter.
Mm-hmm.
I actually met Sony. I was actually shooting for Disney.
Mm-hmm.
and I was shooting Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse, if somebody were to ask me, who's the biggest star you ever shot? I would have to say Mickey Mouse, actually, because he's been a big star for forever.
Right.
You know?
Long-running career.
More people know Mickey than, you know, a lot of the other people that I've shot.
Right.
Even the bigger stars. But at any rate, I was shooting for Disney, but it turned out to be a Sony Disney co-production. So I met some of the Sony folks on that shoot, and it kind of just went from there. So that was specifically stills only, and it was during my relationship with Sony that I started making that transition.
So, with that special relationship that you have with them, you were able to get your hands recently on the Alpha 9. Now, this was described as being something that was going to be for sports. I think that was what they were focusing on.
It's a great action camera, and they're really aiming it at the sports market, but it's also very popular, turning out to be with the wedding market also. But I have to say, after, I've only had it actually in my hands for a few days, but yeah, it's great for stills. I mean, it's super fast. The autofocus is super fast, and it shoots, literally 20 frames per second of RAW, and you don't get bogged down by the buffer. And it'll shoot, I think, over like maybe 12 seconds of 20 frame per second RAW, 24 megapixel. So they're big files. So it has a huge buffer. It uses these new super fast Sony SD cards.
You have to use that card to be able to get the 20 frames.
To get the 20 frames per second RAW, you have to use these cards. I think Lexar also makes cards that are to this spec, so it's not just Sony proprietary. And you have no blackout. And also one thing that's really cool, considering that we're kind of in a film world here in our Paramount, it's a silent shutter, it's an electronic shutter. So all the unit photographers that, like when I was doing unit photography on my friend's movie, you have this big 1950s technology Jacobson blimp, this big box, metal box with foam. Now you can go on set with a camera like this, just as I have it in my hand here, select silent shutter, and you can shoot away. If you're a sports photographer shooting golf, you can now shoot on the backswing.
Now, I wasn't aware of this, so this is interesting. So, to shoot set photography, you would have to use some sort of sound device that would mute the sound of the clicking of the shutter.
Correct. In fact, for example, I was on set shooting Helen Hunt during her scene, and after the scene, she's like, you know what? I hear the click. She's like, I know you need to get your shots. I hear the click. How about after the scene, I'll give you whatever you need. We'll go through the scene and I'll give you your shots. Even with that box, they were still hearing it. Now, they would never say that because it's a completely silent electronic shutter.
Which is amazing, especially if you're doing, street photography, or you're trying to, or you're, as you said, weddings.
Weddings, you can shoot during the ceremony without, in the let's say, if you're shooting, it's funny enough, White House photographers are big fans of Sony cameras. And now, when you see press gaggles at the White House, it's like click, 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 click. Now it can be silent.
Which is, yeah.
And again, for the sports guys, golf, other, you could go to a performance like a ballet
or opera
and get your shots and not disturb. So it's really, really cool.
So, were you able to play or see how it's able to capture fast speed stuff? Is that primarily why they're saying it's good for sports? Or?
I just got that card today, so I actually haven't shot 20 frames per second. But a friend of mine who sent me these cards, another artisan, he had them before me. He shot a wedding with this camera, and I remember the shot he showed me was of the after the ceremony, the couple walking back down the aisle, and he shot it at 20 frames per second of them coming back down the aisle. It looked like a little movie.
Wow!
And it's really cool. And I'll actually I'll get that footage for you. He said I can have that for you.
Oh, cool. So, being the first person to shoot, going back into your career, a feature with the Sony Alphas, is that something that you would continue to try to do, you think? Or?
It was a great experience, and it's absolutely something, well, I did, because I did that one, and then I went on to do another one a month later in Georgia and Tennessee. And so, yes, that was the A7R2. On the next film, we shot with the A7S2 with Zeiss CP2 super speeds.
Oh, wow.
And that worked out really well. So, again, to me, there's also a difference. I wouldn't shoot the feature recording internally because of the specs of how it records internal.
For sure.
But going HDMI out into a Shogun or a Ninja Flame or a Shogun Inferno or Shogun Flame, something like that, it's very high quality.
So that's a Sony Alpha. Let's talk a little bit about drone flying. It's an awkward transition, but you recently.
One thing I want to mention though, I did go out the other day. One of the things that's really cool about this camera is that it has now a dedicated slow and quick mode, and it goes up to 120 frames per second in full HD.
Oh wow!
Which so it's 4K. 4K. So the sensor in this camera is really special. For 4K at 24p or 30p, it does direct pixel readout. So it's reading at 6K and then it's super sampling down to 4K. So you're getting a very high quality 4K file, and that is either recording internally or going out into the Shogun. And then it goes down to HD for 60p and 120, and it'll just record for as long as you want. It's really, really cool.
Well, yeah, those are the same specs on cinema cameras as far as like 120 at HD. So in that little powerhouse, that's awesome. And that is a Sony Alpha 9. Now,
so I would imagine you could go out into like a Shogun Inferno, high frame rate, and it would pick that up, and so you could get again high quality.
Yeah, at 120. Yeah, at 120, which is amazing. So, and we have some footage that we'll be showing very soon.
I just went down in downtown LA. I just did some B-roll, people walking on the street, different frame rates, and just standard, 23.98.
So now I'm going to make my awkward segue and talk about drones, because you recently came into contact with doing drone work, and talk a little bit about how that happened.
That happened. It's very funny. I mean, I'm a pilot. I'm a pilot of airplanes.
Right, an actual pilot.
Actual pilot. And I actually, for a while, I burned out on my fashion photography career. I was just over it. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to do airplane stuff. And so I started writing for airplane magazines. I would go out and, like they do the car magazines, the new 2017 Cadillac Eldorado, and the guy would drive the car and write a review. I did the same thing with airplanes. I would go out and fly an airplane and write a review about what it was like to fly. And I've flown everything from a Piper Cub to a DC-3 to an F-16.
Really?
Doing that. Yeah, it's super fun. And I've flown twice across the Atlantic on different kinds of airplanes, and writing stories about flying airplanes all over. For magazines that are on the newsstands.
Aerial magazines.
Correct,
right.
For pilots. I ended up becoming the editor of one of the #2 airplane magazine on newsstands. So I had fun with aviation for a while, but then I missed photography so much that I kind of brought the airplane stuff down and started
following your other passion,
shooting again, and kind of mixing both. I've decided that I need the airplane stuff and I need the photography and film now. So it turns out that the CEO of one of the drone companies called Unique, and they're one of the largest drone companies for unmanned aerial systems. And he knew I was a pilot. He is an ex-Sony guy, so he knew me from Sony. And he called me one day and he's like, "Hey, you're a pilot, you're a photographer and a filmmaker, and this is a really good combination for us.
Right.
Let's talk about how we can work together on some projects, and let me get you some experience with a drone." And so I went and started flying one of their drones, the Unique Typhoon H.
Had you flown drones before?
I'd never flown drones before. In fact, I was pretty pessimistic about drones.
Yeah, I am too.
As a pilot, because when I fly around in a small airplane, normally the airplane that I fly around is a Cirrus SR-22, I'm, thinking now, not only are we taught as pilots to look out for other airplanes.
And birds.
Oh, I can tell you, once I was flying into Veracruz, Mexico, and I had to dive bomb to mix the pelicans outside and the buzzards getting into the airport. It was pretty nerve-wracking. But birds and now drones. So as a pilot, I was not too thrilled with all the drone activity going on and all the people that are flying where they shouldn't be flying. But once I started flying the drone, I kind of fell in love with it.
Well, I'm terrified of the idea of strapping a camera onto a device that might fly into like a car or something like that, or somebody. Because I've tried to play with just the toy ones in my house, and all I'm able to do is go like up against the wall and terrorize my cat. You know, so that's my like fear of drones. And
So
like
let me put some data on that. So what I really like about the unique Typhoon H specifically, and the Pro specifically. And the difference between the Pro is that it has an Intel RealSense. It's like an advanced obstacle avoidance system that learns. It actually has like a little bit of AI, and it kind of learns too, which is cool. But what I really like about the Typhoon H is that it's a hexcopter. So it has redundancy that the quadcopters don't. If you lose a rotor on the quadcopter, you're tumbling out of the sky. If you lose a rotor on a hexcopter, you'll land because it senses that you have an anomaly, it compensates, and the opposite rotor will start. It does like a quick 3 rotations one way, 3 rotations the other. So theoretically, I haven't experienced it, thankfully, but I know that people have tested it where they'll, take out one of the rotors while it's flying, and it'll settle itself back down.
So this has a permanent camera on it. It's a fixed camera, right?
Permanent it has a camera dedicated to it, but you can switch the cameras out. So, for example, Unique has different spec cameras. They have a wider angle camera that they're 4K. But for example, I used that camera. I have an article in the June 2017 issue of Flying magazine, coincidentally. And I shot the double page opener with the Typhoon H hovering over my friend's airplane that we used for the story on the runway. And I shot that in 4K and then rendered it out in Premiere Plus. I rendered out a 4K still, goosed it in Photoshop, and sent it into the magazine, and now it's running full double page in the magazine.
Wow.
So there's a lot of... So the quality that I'm getting from the cameras from the Unique that are dedicated to the Unique system are quite high. They have a wider angle camera, and I don't know all the specs on the top of my head. They have a camera that is with an equivalent 50 millimeter lens that I quite like using more than the wider angle because it's a little bit more cinematic. They have a thermal camera. They have just different, and they're coming out with some new cameras that are even higher specs. So I'm excited for that.
Wow. So you wrote an article actually for us for HDSLR Shooter that's I think we rolled out on Monday or Tuesday of last week. And so if people want to find out more, they can definitely go and check that out. But so the drone, can you talk a little bit about what is the price point on that?
The Typhoon H, I think it runs anywhere from like $1,200 to $1,800, depending upon how you spec it out and how you kit it out. But it's really affordable, and I mean, again, in my experience, the imagery that I'm getting is high quality.
Excellent. So people want to find out more about you, Jeff. What should they do?
My website is berlincreative.com. My aviation stuff is at area52.co, and that's probably the best 2 ways to find me.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, for sure. No, this has been fun.
Great.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
VER presents HDSLR Shooter live from Cine Gear 2017, sponsored by Blackmagic Design and Carl Zeiss.